The morning the fine arrived began like any other on the farm, with the sun rising slowly over the tree line and the quiet rustle of animals waking in their pens. But beneath that simple rhythm was a tension I did not recognize at first, something creeping in like a faint storm warning before the winds truly shift. For years, I had lived just outside the boundaries of a sprawling HOA-controlled subdivision, close enough that the community often pretended they had authority over the surrounding land, but far enough that legally, their rules had nothing to do with me. My farm sat on a parcel of agriculturally zoned land, purchased long before the subdivision ever existed, and the animals I kept, goats, a few miniature horses, chickens, and 3 aging cattle, were all fully approved under county guidelines. The HOA residents often drove by slowly, glaring, frowning, whispering, but I never thought much of it. Their lives were different from mine, tidier perhaps, but also narrower, boxed in by regulations and committees that seemed more concerned with lawn heights and trash can placement than anything that truly mattered. Over the years, I learned to ignore their sideways looks and their occasional complaints, but the letter taped to my gate that morning was something different. It was printed on official HOA letterhead, which immediately annoyed me because I wasn't under their jurisdiction at all, and beneath the header was a bold statement, notice of immediate fine, $12,000 for unapproved animals. The absurdity of it hit me all at once. For a moment, I wondered if it was a prank, a joke by someone who had too much time on their hands, but then I saw the signature at the bottom: HOA President Marlene Granger, the self-appointed queen of the subdivision, a woman whose reputation for meddling extended far beyond her neatly trimmed cul-de-sac. The summary of violations listed imaginary infractions, unauthorized livestock, excessive animal presence, and even a claim that my animals posed a community nuisance. The paper claimed I had 30 days to remove them or face escalating penalties. I stood by the gate for several minutes, staring at the letter, the morning sun warming the paper in my hand, and slowly the frustration built into something heavier, something that pressed against my chest. None of this made sense, but at the same time it made perfect sense. Marlene had been complaining for months about the smell of farm air, drifting into her perfect backyards even though the subdivision sat a good quarter-mile away. She had complained about roosters crowing, even though mine didn't crow loudly enough to reach her property. She complained about seeing animals grazing through binoculars she used frequently enough that many neighbors joked about it. Still, this fine wasn't just a complaint. This was an action. This was escalation. I carried the letter back to the house, and as I walked past the barn, I found the animals going about their usual routines, completely unaware of the battle forming around them. The goats bleated softly, gathering near the fence for breakfast. The miniature horses paced impatiently, shaking their manes. The cattle swayed near the trough, flicking their tails lazily. Nothing about them was unapproved or illegal. They were exactly where they belonged. That made the anger rise even deeper. Inside, I placed the letter on the kitchen table and read it again, slower this time. There were details I hadn't noticed the first time. References to visual inspection. Claims that the HOA had documented nighttime disturbances. Even accusations that certain animals had been seen wandering near the subdivision after dusk. That made me stop. My animals didn't wander. My fences were tall, solid, and reinforced. I walked the perimeter regularly. If something had happened at night, I would have known, or at least I thought I would have. A strange unease crept in then, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. The letter claimed multiple violations documented after midnight. Why would anyone in the HOA be near my farm after midnight? The idea was unsettling. I had security cameras installed along the property, mostly facing the barn and the tool shed. Standard precautions for someone living near a neighborhood where bored teenagers sometimes made dumb choices. The cameras only stored footage for a week, but that should have been enough to look back and see whatever documentation the HOA claimed to have. Before I checked the footage, I wanted to confirm something else. I called the county zoning office to ask if anyone had filed a complaint. They hadn't. In fact, they were amused, reminding me again that the HOA had no jurisdiction over agricultural land. The agent even said, in a tone that suggested this wasn't the first time, that the HOA president had a habit of overstepping. That should have calmed me, but it didn't. If anything, it made the situation more unnerving. What was Marlene doing? What pushed her to take such an extreme step this time? Why a $12,000 fine when she absolutely knew, she had no authority? I turned my attention to the security footage. The computer in my office was slow, old, but reliable, and I opened the camera archive from the past few nights. The footage scrolled by in sped-up sequences. Animals sleeping, wind moving through the trees, the occasional moth drifting past the lens. Nothing unusual. I checked the timestamps against the letter. The violations supposedly occurred between 2:54 a.m. and 3:17 a.m. I slowed the footage to normal speed. For several minutes, nothing happened. The cameras captured only quiet darkness, the faint shift of animals in the barn. Then, at 3:02 a.m., a figure appeared. At first, it looked like a shadow, something that moved at the edge of the barn. But as the person stepped closer, the night vision captured enough detail to make out clothing. Dark jeans, a heavy jacket, and a hood pulled over the head. The figure walked not along the fence but through the gate, my closed gate. The person didn't climb or force their way in, they walked through, which meant the gate had been opened with deliberate intention. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Someone had come onto my land in the middle of the night. Someone who knew how to get inside. Someone who didn't want to be seen. The figure moved with unsettling confidence, walking along the barn wall, stopping occasionally to look over the fencing. Then the person took out a small flashlight, not bright, just enough to illuminate corners quietly. This wasn't wandering. This wasn't curiosity. This was inspection. Deliberate, secret inspection. The figure paused near the cattle pen, shining the weak beam across the sleeping animals. Then the person turned toward the miniature horse stall, then toward the goats, moving with a methodical rhythm. Every few moments, the person wrote something down, as if cataloging things or taking notes. A chill ran through me as I realized what I was watching. Someone had snuck onto my property in the dead of night to document the supposed violations mentioned in the letter. And based on the clothing, the posture, the slow, controlling movements, I already suspected the truth, but I needed the confirming moment. The moment when the person lifted their head slightly, and the night vision glare hit just enough of the face to reveal the unmistakable sharp jawline and narrow features of HOA President Marlene Granger. There she was, trespassing on my farm at 3 in the morning, conducting her own unauthorized inspection, and using whatever she saw, or thought she saw, to justify a $12,000 fine she had no power to enforce. For a few seconds, I could only stare at the screen, stunned. The recording showed her staying for nearly 20 minutes, wandering through my property as though it were her own, writing notes, inspecting animals, and then leaving through the same gate she had entered. She even closed it behind her. Everything she wanted to hide was captured clearly, outlined in the grainy green glow of night vision footage. My shock gradually shifted into something sharper. This wasn't just harassment. This wasn't just an overstepping HOA president sticking her nose where it didn't belong. This was trespassing, stalking, and fabricating violations on land she had no authority over. Something deeper was going on here. Something Marlene didn't want anyone to see. And as I sat there replaying the footage, I realized the fine wasn't the threat. The fine was the distraction. Whatever Marlene was doing on my land at 3 a.m., she wasn't doing it for the HOA. She was doing it for herself. This discovery was only the beginning, and as the footage ended, the chapter of my quiet life ended with it, opening the door to something far more turbulent waiting just beyond the next nightfall. The next morning arrived with a gray and heavy sky, the kind that made the air feel thicker than usual, as though the atmosphere itself sensed the turmoil settling over the farm. I had barely slept, replaying the footage of Marlene moving through my property again and again, each viewing making her actions feel more invasive and deliberate. By dawn, my exhaustion had blended with a sharp clarity. This was not something I could ignore or simply confront her about. Trespassing at 3 in the morning was not just a matter of overzealous HOA enthusiasm. It was a calculated act, one with intent hidden beneath the surface, As I stepped outside, the animals stirred in their routine familiarity, a comforting contrast to the unease twisting inside me. The goats bleated for food, completely unaware of the storm building around them. The cattle shifted lazily, tails flicking at early flies. The miniature horses pawed at the dirt, energetic and unaware. Everything looked normal, but the farm no longer felt untouched by outside eyes. As I did the morning rounds, I checked the gate she had used. The latch wasn't damaged, not forced, not bent. It was opened and closed gently, exactly as someone with the proper knowledge or time would do. That meant she hadn't climbed the fence or cut through wire. She had walked in knowingly with purpose. The unsettling part was realizing I had no idea how many times she might have done it before. That single thought lingered as I returned to the house and sat down at the desk to evaluate my next steps. I couldn't go to the sheriff immediately, not without organizing everything. They would want exact timestamps, clear footage, a written account, and proof that I was not under HOA authority. I needed a record that would hold up under scrutiny, but I also couldn't risk Marlene returning. If she had come once, she could come again, and given her midnight inspection, she was clearly not afraid to trespass. That motivated me to pull out a notebook and begin creating a timeline, every moment, every detail from the footage. I wrote down her arrival time, how she approached the gate, how long she lingered at each section of the farm, the way she scribbled notes, the direction she left. As I wrote, patterns began forming in my mind. She hadn't wandered aimlessly. She had moved straight toward the cattle, then toward the miniature horses, then the goats, as though she already knew where each animal was kept at that hour. It was possible she had memorized the layout from daytime glimpses, but it still felt unnervingly precise. After documenting everything, I checked the rest of the week's footage. The cameras stored 7 days of data, which meant I had about 5 days remaining before older clips began to overwrite themselves. Hours of nighttime recordings passed by uneventfully, wind pushing through trees, the barn sleeping under the moonlight, the occasional wandering raccoon. But on the second, till last night, I saw something else. At 2:47 a.m., a moving shadow appeared near the fencing. It was too small and indistinct to identify clearly, just a human silhouette walking the perimeter slowly, not inside the property this time, but outside, tracing the edge. The person moved along the back fence, then the east side, then paused near the cattle pen. The figure lingered there for several minutes before moving on and disappearing beyond the tree line. The shape was too blurred to identify as Marlene or someone else, but the timing was too similar to ignore. A creeping dread spread across my chest. She hadn't inspected the property only once. She had been surveying it, observing it, studying it in preparation for the night she entered. This wasn't about animals being unapproved or causing disturbances. This was strategic, intentional behavior. Something far stranger and more disturbing was at play. That realization made me uneasy for a new reason. If she was sneaking around the property repeatedly, she wasn't acting alone. Someone would have noticed her leaving her home in the dead of night. Neighbors, dogs, security systems, streetlights. She couldn't have just slipped away unnoticed, especially not repeatedly. That meant her behavior was either supported by the HOA board or hidden from them entirely. Both possibilities were equally troubling. I spent the next hour searching the HOA website, scanning through meeting minutes, newsletters, even local gossip forums where residents frequently complained about HOA power plays. Buried beneath posts about lawn heights and improper holiday decorations, I found a pattern: multiple mentions of Marlene's obsession with expansion, comments about her pushing for land acquisitions, rumors about her trying to rezone properties that bordered the HOA. Even more concerning were several complaints from residents saying she had been scouting nearby lands to assess what could be annexed into the HOA in future years. That made my breath catch slightly. If she wanted to absorb my land into the HOA, the livestock would be an obstacle. Agricultural zoning was incompatible with HOA control. My farm would have to be deemed a nuisance or a violation of some kind to justify pressuring the county to consider rezoning. Suddenly, her nighttime inspections made far too much sense. She wasn't trying to find me for animals she disliked. She was trying to build a record of violations. to claim the land was mismanaged or hazardous, hoping to leverage it into something bigger. Perhaps she wanted the land for a park, a greenbelt, a community facility, or for future property expansions. Whatever her motive, her plan required fabricating problems, and she needed false evidence to support her case. If she had successfully gathered that evidence under the cover of darkness, without the cameras, I might have never known. But now that I had the footage, everything changed. As the pieces connected in my mind, a cold, calculated resolve took root. She expected me to panic at the fine, argue, or admit defeat. She expected resistance, but not evidence, not the kind that showed her trespassing. I realized I had a weapon far stronger than any angry phone call or complaint. I had visual, undeniable proof, but I needed more. I needed her motive solidly established. I needed to expose not just the trespassing but the intention behind it, and to do that, I needed to watch her behavior more closely. I spent the rest of the day improving the security measures on the farm. I installed a second set of cameras, hidden this time, pointing at angles the obvious cameras didn't cover. If Marlene returned, and I was sure she would, I would catch her in even clearer detail. As afternoon drifted toward dusk, I walked the perimeter of the fence, checking for tampering, loose boards, or signs someone had manipulated the gate. Everything looked pristine, as if untouched, which made the intrusion even more unsettling. She had entered through the gate itself. Either she had picked the lock or she had a copy of the key. Neither possibility made sense. I had never given a key to anyone except a farm hand who no longer worked here. The lock wasn't the kind that could be picked easily, especially in the dark. Perhaps she had simply slid the chain out of place. It was secure, but not impenetrable. Still, her confidence unsettled me deeply. As darkness overtook the sky, the farm fell into its routine nighttime quiet. The animals settled into their pens, the barn gave off a faint warm glow from its security light, and the crickets began their usual chorus. But beneath that ordinary calm, I sensed the tension rising again. Marlene had visited my property twice that week, once outside the fence, once inside. People with intentions like hers did not stop after being emboldened. They escalated. As I sat by the window, watching the moon rise above the treetops, my mind replayed all the posts I had read, the rumors of her controlling nature, the way she lobbied aggressively for HOA expansions, her hints about future development opportunities. If she saw my farm as land standing in her way, land she couldn't control, then she wouldn't simply give up. The fine was the first blow, trespassing was the second. The next step would be more desperate, more invasive, and far more dangerous for her. That thought brought a calm steadiness to my resolve. I would be ready. As the night deepened, the cameras recorded silently, watching every corner of the property with tireless precision. And somewhere beyond the tree line, beyond the reach of my lights, beyond the safety of the farm's familiar boundaries, I sensed that Marlene was preparing her next move. Night settled over the farm like a heavy curtain, thick and unbroken, swallowing every distant sound until the only things left were the low murmurs of animals shifting in their stalls and the rhythmic hum of crickets pulsing from the surrounding woods. The atmosphere, normally peaceful and grounding, carried a different weight now, a subtle but unmistakable tension that seemed to seep into the soil itself. I moved through the house in dim lighting, careful not to disturb the quiet as I checked the security system again and again. Every camera, every angle, every motion sensor had become a lifeline, a watchful guardian tasked with capturing whatever new intrusion might unfold. The footage from the past nights had left a mark, not of fear but of awareness, sharpening my instincts until I felt attuned to every shift in the air. The new hidden cameras I installed earlier in the day were synced and ready, recording in higher clarity and placed deliberately where no passerby could detect them. If Marlene returned, she would not escape unnoticed again. The night hours crept forward with agonizing slowness as I remained awake, resisting the temptation of sleep. Midnight approached, then passed, and the familiar darkness of early morning settled in. This was her hour, the hour she had chosen repeatedly, the hour no normal HOA president should have a reason to be awake and wandering through private farmland. I sat in silence by the window, overlooking the yard illuminated only by faint moonlight. From here, I could see the tops of the barn and the shimmer of the metal fencing, peaceful at a glance but hiding the possibility of intrusion. The thought of someone creeping through the fields at this time made the night feel colder than usual. I checked the security monitor again, still calm. Nothing more than animals shifting in the barn or some wind stirring the grass at the edge of the fields. Yet I had the sense, almost a certainty, that she would return. People driven by obsession did not abandon their patterns easily, and Marlene was nothing if not driven. The first sign came suddenly, subtle enough that I almost dismissed it. On camera 6, a view facing the east pasture, I noticed a faint distortion of movement. Not a figure, not a shadow, just a shift in the texture of darkness, the kind that made the hairs on the back of my neck lift. I rewound the footage several seconds, then played it again at normal speed. The movement was there, slow, careful, deliberate. Something was approaching from the wooded edge, staying low and close to the ground. It blended almost seamlessly with the shadows, moving inch by inch. For a long moment, I could not distinguish its shape. Then the silhouette rose, a person, alone, moving with measured caution, one foot placed in front of the other, pausing often, scanning. They approached the fence near the cattle pen, the same area where the earlier shadow had lingered days before. My chest tightened. She was back. This time, she approached differently, not through the front gate like before, but through the side, near the tree line, using the darkest route possible, as if she now feared being seen. That shift in behavior was telling. She was aware, or at least suspicious, that her previous visit may not have gone unnoticed. Camera 6 captured her more clearly now as she stepped into the open. Faint moonlight revealed the unmistakable outline of her heavy coat, the same one I had seen in the first trespassing footage. She wore the hood again, pulled low over her head, keeping her face hidden. Her posture was tense, cautious. She moved along the fence, testing a section with her gloved hand, applying pressure at different points. Then she paused, bending slightly, examining something on the ground. I leaned closer to the monitor. She was inspecting hoof prints, normal animal tracks made by the cattle that grazed there. She traced one with her fingertips before writing something down in the small notebook she carried. Her behavior was more meticulous tonight, almost frantic in its precision. Whatever she was documenting, it mattered to her deeply. She continued moving along the fence, reaching the area behind the goat enclosure. There she stopped again, this time taking longer, surveying the field behind the barn as though expecting to see something unusual. When nothing appeared, she took out her phone, holding it low as she snapped photos. Then she moved with greater urgency toward the back gate, trying the latch. It rattled softly, a delicate metallic sound captured faintly by the audio feed. The gate held firm. Unlike the front, this one was secured with a reinforced chain and a new lock. Her frustration showed even through her posture. She tried again, then gave up, stepping back to look around. Her searching gestures suggested she was trying to find another entry point, another weakness. The urgency in her movements made everything clear. She wasn't simply gathering notes tonight. She was hunting for something. Proof, evidence, or perhaps a justification she needed to support her plan. The realization formed slowly, chillingly. She wanted the animals to appear in violation. She wanted them outside their enclosures, wandering near the subdivision. She wanted the land to seem neglected or unsafe. She was looking for a reason to escalate her claims, but why tonight? Why the desperation? That thought lingered heavily. I switched to camera 9. The new hidden one installed near the barn where the shadows tended to pool deepest. Moments later, she appeared on the screen, scanning the barn doors as though expecting them to be ajar. Her breathing was visible in the chilly air, small clouds drifting from her hood. She approached the lock and tugged, testing its strength. Finding it secure, she stepped back and circled the barn slowly, searching for another way in. She wasn't inspecting animals anymore. She was inspecting access points. I watched her movements with growing unease. Her behavior tonight was no longer just obsessive. It was invasive in a way that crossed a different boundary entirely. She was probing my property systematically, searching for the smallest vulnerability she could exploit. And then, just as she reached the final corner of the barn, she stopped abruptly. The camera captured the slow widening of her stance, the slight tilt of her head as she sensed something. She crouched quickly, slipping into the narrow space between the barn and the fencing, disappearing briefly out of frame. I held my breath. Camera 10 picked her up from a different angle. Hidden between two stacked hay bales, this angle provided a narrow but clear view of the gap behind the barn. Marlene moved into the shadows, almost hugging the barn wall as she knelt near the foundation. It took me several seconds to understand what she was doing. She was digging. With gloved hands, she scraped at the soil, slow and careful at first, then faster as she uncovered something. I felt a cold, sinking sensation sweep through me as she pulled it free. It was small, rectangular, metallic, a device of some kind, and as she inspected it, turning it over in her hands, the camera caught the glint of tiny LED. A tracker, or something similar, hidden on my property, buried just inches beneath the soil. My stomach twisted in shock. Someone had placed that device there, and judging by the tension in her movements, she already knew exactly where it was. This was not her discovering it. This was her retrieving it. She glanced around quickly, ensuring no one was nearby, then shoved the device into her pocket. Her hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from adrenaline. Whatever the device recorded, whatever it was meant to track, she now had it. This was no longer simply trespassing for the sake of petty HOA disputes. This was something deeper, darker, and anchored in intentions that stretched beyond fines or fabricated violations. For her to bury something on my land and dig it up again meant she had a plan, one that required secrecy and evidence collected without my knowledge. She stood, brushing dirt off her gloves, then moved rapidly back toward the tree line. She no longer surveyed the fences or the animals. She left in a hurry, almost stumbling as she crossed into the woods. She knew the risk. She knew time was running out. The cameras followed her until she slipped out of sight, swallowed by the darkness beyond the pasture. I sat frozen for several long minutes, replaying what I had witnessed. A device hidden behind the barn, placed deliberately, retrieved hurriedly. Whatever it recorded, movement, sound, proximity, she now had the data. And the question that pressed hardest was not how she placed it, nor when, but why. What was she trying to prove? What story was she trying to build? What narrative had she constructed so thoroughly that she needed secret data to support it? As dawn began to creep slowly into the sky, washing the farm with pale light, one thing became painfully clear. This was not about animals. This was not about fines. This was not even about expanding HOA territory. Something else lurked beneath her actions. A motive deeper and far more personal. And whatever it was, I knew she had only just begun. The following days unfolded in a tense, heavy quiet that lingered around the property like an unseen fog, thick and difficult to shake as I moved through my routines trying to maintain some sense of normality despite the storm that had settled over my life. Every step around the farm reminded me of how deeply the HOA had pierced into what I considered my private sanctuary. Their threats had shoved themselves into the rhythm of feeding animals and repairing fences and checking security cameras, until even the smallest creak of wood or rustle of leaves made me suspect something was wrong. The memory of the HOA president sneaking onto my land at 3 in the morning haunted me constantly, becoming a kind of mental replay I could not turn off. A reminder that the battle I had stepped into was much larger than a simple dispute over animals. It was a fight over privacy, rights, intimidation, and a level of corruption I hadn't expected to find in a neighborhood that advertised itself as calm, organized, and neighborly. The fine of $12,000 still sat like a dead weight in the back of my mind, but the footage had changed everything. It had given me leverage, proof, and a path forward, if I was willing to take the risk. That footage, however, also created an opposite reaction inside me. Fear of what else might have been happening that I hadn't seen. Fear of how many nights someone might have strolled across my land while I slept unaware. The animals sensed the tension too, crowding closer to me than usual, as though feeling the weight of my unease ripple through the quiet fields. My horses paced restlessly, the goats bleated with nervous energy, and even the chickens stayed closer to the barn than wandering out into the open. My farm had always been their home, peaceful and protected, but now even they acted as if the perimeter had been breached in ways they couldn't quite understand but could instinctively feel. I checked the security cameras at least 3 times a day, combing through hours of footage with meticulous attention, searching for any sign of another intrusion, another shadow moving where it shouldn't be, but each day presented nothing new, not yet. Still, the emptiness on the footage did little to comfort me. Instead, it made me wonder if the HOA president had only been caught that one night because he had made a mistake, because he hadn't expected me to upgrade my cameras when I had. If he had been trespassing before, perhaps he had found ways around the old blind spots, slipping into the darkness undetected. That thought alone was enough to keep me on edge as I prepared for the next HOA board meeting. A meeting I knew would be hostile, controlled, and stacked against me from the moment I walked through the doors. The fine would be discussed, and they would attempt to reinforce their accusations with fabricated confidence. Ignoring any legal definitions of livestock, they didn't want to acknowledge and weaponizing bylaws I knew they hadn't even read thoroughly. But this time, I would not be entering the meeting defenseless. I printed still images from the footage, stored copies on multiple drives, and rehearsed the structure of my presentation in my head as though preparing for a courtroom trial. As the meeting date approached, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted to something prickly and curious, like everyone knew something dramatic was brewing, but couldn't quite name it out loud. A few neighbors watched me with cautious sympathy. Others avoided eye contact entirely, and a couple silently recorded me with their phones when they thought I wasn't looking, clearly eager to catch any hint of chaos they could later gossip about. HOA communities fed on conflict the way dry brush feeds on sparks, and rumors traveled faster than truth in places like this. On the morning of the meeting, I walked the entire property one last time, checking gates, cameras, fences, and locks with an intensity that bordered obsession, knowing I needed to feel grounded before stepping into enemy territory. My mind fixated on the image of the HOA president creeping across my land, his shadow stretching along the barn wall as he slipped past the livestock enclosure with intentions I still hadn't fully uncovered. Whether he had been searching for something, planting something, or simply trying to gather evidence for the fine they later issued, I couldn't say with certainty. All I knew was that his actions had crossed a boundary that no fine, no letter, and no HOA rule could justify. My attorney had reviewed the footage and confirmed what I already suspected. The HOA president had committed trespassing, and not the harmless kind people brushed off. This was premeditated, intentional, and occurred at a time of night that raised questions about motive. The legal implications were significant, and the HOA board had no authority to ignore or dismiss them. That gave me strength as I prepared my documents, organizing them into folders that told a clear chronological story. The notice, the fine, the bylaws, the legal definitions of livestock in rurals, owned communities, and then the footage, printed frame by frame to show the president moving through private property under cover of darkness. When I finally left the farm and drove toward the community center, the road felt strangely narrower than usual, lined with houses that seemed to stare back at me, as though they too acknowledged the weight of what I was about to unfold. The parking lot was fuller than I expected, cars strewn into every available space, suggesting the meeting had drawn more attention than typical HOA gatherings. People loved drama, especially when it involved the board, and word must have spread. As I walked inside, the energy in the room shifted. Conversations quieted, eyes followed, and the board, sitting elevated at the front like a panel of judges, stiffened visibly when they saw me carrying folders. The HOA president avoided looking directly at me, his posture rigid, his hands pressed flat against the table as though bracing himself against an unseen force. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me then, a determination that solidified as the meeting opened and the agenda was read aloud. They tried to rush toward the fine discussion quickly, and the moment my name was mentioned, several people straightened in their seats, tuning in like an audience waiting for a reveal. The board attempted to speak with authority, their tone dismissive and confident as they referenced their fabricated violation. But as soon as I was granted the floor, the balance in the room shifted again, subtly but sharply. I presented the documents methodically, laying out the legal facts with an almost surgical precision, watching their expressions flicker with discomfort as the narrative they had built began to crumble under the weight of real evidence. And then came the moment I placed the printed images of the trespassing footage on the table. The reaction was instant. The room erupted into murmurs, shocked whispers, and audible gasps as people leaned forward to get a closer look. The HOA president's face drained of color as he stared at the images, his jaw tightening, his posture collapsing inward as though the air had been punched out of him. The board tried to regain control of the meeting, but the damage was already done. The members knew something serious had been exposed. What had begun as a weapon against me had become the very evidence that might dismantle the board's credibility entirely. As the chaos in the room grew and the board scrambled to silence the rising wave of outrage, I stood quietly, breathing steadily, knowing the tide had turned, and that the real fallout had only just begun. The meeting was adjourned abruptly, board members whisper, yelling among themselves while attendees gossiped excitedly. I walked out without a word, feeling the weight on my shoulders shift from burden to momentum. The battle ahead would not be easy, but the truth had finally cut through the darkness, and as I drove home, I knew this was only the beginning of unraveling everything the HOA had tried to hide. The drive home from the chaotic HOA meeting felt strangely silent, as though the car itself was holding its breath alongside me, absorbing the aftershocks of what had just unfolded. Even the familiar roads seemed different now, lined with an invisible tension that clung to everything I passed, from the manicured lawns to the identical mailboxes placed in rigid rows like soldiers awaiting orders. For the first time since the conflict began, the power dynamic had shifted, and although I had anticipated some relief, what settled over me instead was a deeper, more complex weight. Exposing the HOA president's trespassing had been necessary, even inevitable, but it opened a door to consequences I knew would echo far beyond a single meeting. People didn't react well when their authority was challenged, especially those who had grown accustomed to operating without oversight, and the expression on the president's face before he abruptly adjourned the meeting told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. When I pulled into the driveway, the quiet of the farm greeted me like a familiar blanket, though the peace felt fragile, stretched thin by the storm swirling around it. The animals stirred as I stepped out of the truck, their movements soft against the backdrop of the setting sun. The horses whinnied low, restless, picking up on my lingering adrenaline as though it radiated off me in a frequency only they could sense. I tried to settle myself by walking the property perimeter again, something that had become part of my daily ritual since the footage first revealed the president's trespassing. Each fence post, each gate latch, each shadow stretching across the ground felt like a detail demanding my attention, a reminder that vigilance was no longer optional, it was mandatory. The night after the meeting arrived quickly, faster than I expected, wrapping the farm in darkness that seemed thicker than usual, as though the land itself felt wary of what might come next. I found sleep difficult, tossing in bed as thoughts spiraled faster than I could calm them. I wondered whether the HOA president would retaliate, whether the board would attempt to twist the situation, whether the community would rally behind them or turn against them now that the truth had cracked open the polished facade they tried so hard to maintain. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under an uneven waves, and when I finally drifted into sleep, it felt shallow, stretched thin like paper. But even in that restless state, a sudden noise jolted me awake. It was faint, almost imagined, but enough to snap my senses into sharp alert. I sat motionless, listening to the night breathe outside, every sound amplified by the darkness. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant chirp of crickets, the faint rustle of branches against the roof, all familiar sounds, yet beneath them was something else, something subtle but unmistakably out of place. I waited, muscles tense, and then there it was again, the soft crunch of gravel beneath a footstep. Adrenaline surged through me as I checked the time, 3:06 a.m. Eerily close to the same hour, I'd caught the HOA president sneaking across my land in the footage. The repetition sent a cold ripple through my chest as I moved toward my desk, pulling up the live feed from the security cameras with hurried fingers. The monitors illuminated the room in pale blue light, each camera displaying its slice of the property in grainy night vision. For a moment everything seemed still, and I wondered if the sound had merely been an echo of my anxiety, a phantom noise conjured by stress, But then, on camera 3, the west side of the barn, I saw movement. A shadow, faint but deliberate, sliding between the silhouette of the barn and the goat enclosure. The figure moved slowly, crouched low, its outline barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness. My heart pounded as I leaned closer, narrowing my eyes, waiting for the figure to step into better light. When it did, even partially, I recognized the shape, the build, the posture. It was the HOA president. Again, on my property, at 3 in the morning, the shock lasted only a fraction of a second before transforming into something sharper, colder, more strategic. Unlike the last time I was prepared, I hit record immediately, ensuring every movement captured on screen was saved to multiple folders. He moved with purpose, not simply wandering, but scanning the ground as though searching for something specific. His flashlight remained off, suggesting he didn't want to draw attention, and he paused occasionally to look back toward the road, as if expecting someone or ensuring no one followed him. The behavior raised more questions than answers, and suspicion curled deep in my gut as I watched from the safety of the house, documenting every step. What was he looking for? Evidence he had planted. Something he left behind during his previous trespassing. Or perhaps he was scouting for new ways to trap me in fabricated violations. The more I watched, the more the unease evolved into something else, a realization that whatever he was doing, he wasn't confident. His movements lacked the arrogance he had displayed during the meeting. Instead, he seemed frantic, desperate, almost panicked. As he approached the livestock gate, he crouched and appeared to reach under the wooden beam, feeling around as though searching for a hidden object. My stomach twisted. If he had planted something previously, something designed to incriminate me, he might now be trying to retrieve it before anyone else uncovered it. That possibility ignited a fresh surge of anger, but I forced it down, knowing emotion could not lead this moment. I needed clarity, precision, documentation. After several tense minutes, the president abruptly stood, looked around again, and hurried back toward the opposite fence line, slipping through the shadows until the camera lost sight of him. The feed went still once more, the farm quiet again, but the damage was done. He had trespassed for a second time, and this time I had clearer footage, more angles, and undeniable proof of intent. Still shaken but focused, I compiled the footage, labeling each file with precise timestamps, camera numbers, and locations. The evidence was stacking itself into a narrative no board could ignore, no committee could spin, no homeowner could deny. And yet, beneath the satisfaction of gathering proof was another feeling. Fear, not for myself, but for how far the president and possibly the other board members might be willing to go to silence the truth. People backed into corners acted unpredictably, especially when their reputations, power, and control hinged on maintaining a carefully crafted illusion. As the first hints of dawn touched the sky, I stepped onto the porch, letting the cool air cut through the heaviness in my chest. The farm remained still, the animals unaware of the turmoil unraveling around them, their routines unbroken by the shadows that prowled through the night. I knew I couldn't keep this new footage to myself. I would need to take it to my attorney, present it to law enforcement, and prepare for the firestorm that would inevitably follow. This wasn't simply an HOA dispute anymore. It was a revelation of something deeper, darker, and undeniably deliberate. And as the sun finally crested over the horizon, illuminating the fields with soft amber light, I felt the shape of the next chapter forming in the back of my mind, a chapter where truth would come to light, and where the HOA president's midnight trespassing would no longer exist in secrecy. The battle was escalating, shifting from concealed sabotage to open exposure, and everything within me understood one thing clearly: the war had only just begun. Morning sunlight washed across the farm with a deceptive softness, illuminating the fields and fences as though nothing unusual had occurred just hours earlier, but beneath that gentle glow, the land felt charged with the remnants of the night's intrusion. The animals followed their usual routines, the horses stretching their necks over the stall doors, the goats bleating impatiently for feed, the chickens darting about with their frantic morning energy. But I moved among them with a heavier awareness, my thoughts looping endlessly around the footage. of the HOA president creeping across my property at 3 a.m. With every step I took through the dew-covered grass, I felt the tension woven deeper into the fabric of the place, as though the farm itself understood it had become the battleground for something larger than livestock regulations or HOA fines. After tending to the animals, I returned to the house to finalize the clips and prepare to meet with my attorney. The footage was damning, more incriminating than anything I had captured before, and as I watched it again, slowed down, zoomed in, analyzed frame by frame, the strangeness of the president's behavior became even more pronounced. He didn't wander aimlessly, he knew exactly where he wanted to look. His movements were methodical, focused on specific areas around the livestock gate and the goat pasture, almost as though he had been tracking something he already placed there. That suspicion clung to me as I organized the files into a secure folder backed up on 2 external drives. Whatever he was trying to retrieve, or verify, felt central to the bigger picture I still didn't fully understand. It wasn't enough for the HOA to fabricate violations. Someone was actively working to create or manipulate evidence on my land, and the president was personally involved. By mid-morning, I drove to my attorney's office, the evidence secure in a locked case in the passenger seat. The drive felt longer than usual, each mile weighed down by the gravity of what I was about to reveal. As I entered the office and handed over the compiled footage, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. While he reviewed the clips, I watched the tension leave his posture only to return in a different form, sharpened this time by something firmer than concern, purpose. When he finished examining the footage, he began outlining the next steps, and though the plan was clear, the implications were sobering. We were moving toward escalation, formal police reporting, potential criminal charges, a restraining order, and evidence files prepared for submission to county authorities. This wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. It was about exposing misconduct, abuse of authority, and a string of deliberate actions meant to manipulate an entire system. Leaving the attorney's office, I sensed the thin line that separated unease from outright alarm had been crossed. The president's nighttime trespassing was no longer a bizarre anomaly. It was a symptom of something deeper, possibly involving multiple members of the HOA board. Back at the farm, the tranquility of the property did little to ease my thoughts. I walked the perimeter again, scanning the ground for anything unusual, and near the back fence line, something caught my eye. A faint indentation in the soil, shaped like the tread of a boot, pointed directly toward the portion of the fence the president had approached during the night. Kneeling down, I studied the mark, noticing it wasn't alone. Several prints trailed through the thinner grass, partially masked by early wind, but still distinct enough to suggest movement from someone who didn't want to leave a noticeable path. The realization pulled another thread of unease through me. If the president had visited multiple times, what else had he done that I wasn't aware of? What else might be hidden on the property, planted to incriminate me or justify the HOA unprecedented fines? I continued checking the fence line, moving deeper into the shaded area near the tree line, and that was when I found something that made my stomach twist, a small plastic tag half, buried in the dirt near the base of a fence post. It was unmarked but shaped like the kind used for livestock identification, the kind I'd never used on my animals. The tag was clean despite being in the soil, suggesting it hadn't been there long. Though I couldn't confirm its origin yet, the timing felt suspicious. I slipped it into a sealed evidence bag and returned to the house, scanning the ground around me with renewed vigilance. Each new discovery added weight to the growing theory that the president was either planting false evidence or checking on previously planted items. The pattern was becoming hard to deny. That afternoon, I reviewed older footage, going back weeks, searching for anything I might have overlooked. Most nights were uneventful, just animals, the shifting shadows of trees, or the occasional vehicle passing along the distant road. But then, 3 weeks earlier, well before the first fine appeared in my mailbox, I noticed something. At almost exactly the same time, 3:12 a.m., a faint figure appeared near the far corner of the goat pasture. The camera quality at that angle was lower, and the person remained near the edge of the frame, but even blurred and partially obscured, the shape resembled the same build and movement style as the president. My pulse quickened as I replayed the clip, adjusting the contrast for clarity. The figure lingered for nearly 4 minutes before disappearing into the shadows again. 3 weeks. That meant the president's trespassing wasn't a reaction to the meeting or the first confrontation. It predated everything. It was the foundation of whatever scheme the HOA had been building. The idea that their $12,000 fine and possibly other upcoming penalties were all arranged around false evidence planted on my land was maddening, but also clarifying. Everything suddenly aligned with frightening coherence. The president wasn't acting erratically. He was trying to maintain control over a plan that was beginning to slip through his fingers. As evening fell, I felt the shift in the air again, that same taut stillness that had crept across the land the night before. I turned on every security light, double-checked the cameras, and walked the property one last time before nightfall. The animals sensed the tension as well. Even the horses seemed unusually alert, their ears flicking toward every distant sound. I ate dinner in silence, reviewing notes and preparing the formal report that would accompany the evidence. The attorney had warned me that once the authorities became involved, the situation would escalate quickly, possibly violently, and I needed to be ready. The quiet hours stretched until the early morning again, and although exhaustion tugged at me, I stayed awake, watching the monitors. Then, almost predictably, the motion alert chimed. I froze as the notification flashed across the screen, and when camera 5 illuminated, my worst suspicions were confirmed. The president was back, but this time, he wasn't alone. The footage showed 2 other individuals moving along the fence line with him, their movements cautious but urgent, as though working against a deadline. Fear washed through me, colder and heavier than anything before. This wasn't trespassing anymore. It was a coordinated effort, a deliberate operation, a direct threat. And as I hit record once again, documenting every second of their coordinated intrusion, I understood fully that the conflict had crossed a threshold that could no longer be handled quietly, privately, or diplomatically. The shadows moving through my property were no longer signs of desperation. They were signs of escalation, and whatever they intended to do next would change everything. The moment I realized the HOA president wasn't alone, a deeper chill settled over me, heavier and more suffocating than any tension I had felt in the days prior, because the presence of 2 additional figures transformed everything from an unsettling pattern of trespassing into the unmistakable outline of a coordinated operation taking place under the cover of darkness on land that legally belonged to me. As the 3 silhouettes moved through the night, their motions synchronized and purposeful, the gravity of the situation expanded into something far larger than a petty dispute over livestock or fabricated HOA fines. It was now a deliberate, organized intrusion, and each step they took across my property seemed to echo with the silent acknowledgement that they no longer feared being caught, or perhaps believed whatever they were doing was worth the considerable risk. Watching from the glow of the monitors, I kept my breathing steady and my hands still, recording everything and noting the exact timestamps as the intruders made their way toward the goat enclosure. The same area the president had inspected the night before, solidifying the theory that they were either planting or retrieving items connected to their escalating scheme. One of the figures carried something long and narrow, partially wrapped in a dark cloth, and though the low light resolution made it impossible to identify from the feed alone, the object's shape triggered a cold suspicion that perhaps they were planning to stage evidence more blatant than the small tag I had found earlier. The president scanned the surroundings repeatedly, his posture wound tight with tension, indicating he knew how risky this operation had become. Yet he pushed on, driven by something deeper than simple HOA bureaucracy, driven by fear, panic, and the desperate need to cover whatever tracks he believed would soon unravel. When they reached the far end of the pasture, the 3 of them crouched together in a tight circle, partially obscured by the angle of the camera, but not enough to conceal their frantic movements. I could see hands moving, digging, shifting the soil, and every second of it fed into a growing certainty that they were planting incriminating items meant to support more fabricated fines or worse, set the foundation for legal action against me that could result in seizure, forced compliance, or crippling financial penalties. The awareness that this was no longer a random act but a premeditated, organized attempt to target me stirred something fierce and resolute in my chest, and rather than letting fear take hold, I focused on documenting everything with unwavering precision, knowing that evidence collected tonight could be the key to dismantling the entire operation. As they continued their work, I zoomed in on each angle, capturing the silhouettes, the tools, the motions, the pacing. Small details that would be invaluable in establishing intent and coordination. After nearly 15 minutes of frantic digging and repositioning, the group stood abruptly and moved toward the livestock gate, checking the hinges and latch as though ensuring something would align perfectly with whatever they had hidden earlier. The president paused, scanning the area with increased urgency, and for a brief moment he turned toward the house, his outline framed by the faint moonlight, and even at a distance, I could sense the anxiety radiating off him, an unmistakable sign that he knew they were running out of time before their actions were discovered. After the final check of the pasture, the trio made their way toward the north property line, slipping through the shadows until they fell out of the camera's range, but I kept watching for several minutes longer, waiting for any sign they might return or attempt another area. When the last motion alert faded, the stillness that returned to the farm felt deceptive, like the quiet left behind after a storm that had only begun to reveal its true strength. With the footage secured, I backed up every file to multiple drives, aware that one technological failure could jeopardize everything. And as I waited for the data to transfer, the unsettling question hovered in my mind. Why would the HOA president risk not only his position but potential criminal charges by orchestrating repeated trespassing missions with others? The answer, though not yet fully clear, was slowly taking shape. Something more was at stake. Something beyond HOA regulations, something tied perhaps to land value, hidden agendas within the board, or debts and pressures unseen by the public. The president's panic, his desperation, the urgency with which he combed through the pasture, these weren't the actions of someone trying to win a petty dispute. They were the actions of someone trying to bury something that could destroy him. As dawn crept over the horizon, I walked the property again, this time not out of routine but out of necessity, searching for anything the intruders might have left behind. The soil in the far pasture appeared slightly disturbed. The grass flattened in small patches where knees and boots had pressed into the earth. And although the freshly dug area had been carefully smoothed over, the subtle inconsistencies in texture betrayed its recent manipulation. I marked the spot with a small flag before returning to the house for tools and photographing everything for documentation. Beneath the surface, less than 6 inches down, I found the first object, a small metal latch tagged with a livestock identification number that didn't match any series I had ever used. Another 2 inches deeper lay a vial of something unidentifiable, sealed but suspiciously placed near the enclosure, as though meant to suggest contamination or disease. My heart hammered with a mix of shock and outrage as I unearthed each item, realizing the trio had planted enough staged evidence to frame me for multiple violations: animal neglect, hazardous material storage, and even potential environmental infractions. The magnitude of the scheme was staggering, and it became painfully clear that the president had planned to weaponize these fabricated violations to cripple me financially, perhaps even forcing foreclosure or seizure of the land. As the weight of the revelation settled over me, a new determination took root, stronger and more unyielding than anything before. I documented every angle of the planted evidence before carefully sealing each item in separate bags, noting the location, depth, and surrounding soil conditions. Each piece strengthened the case not only against the president, but against anyone involved in orchestrating and executing the midnight operation. The hours passed in a blur of preparation, and with every new detail secured, the path forward became clearer. The authorities needed to see everything, the attorney needed the full scope of evidence, and the community, misled for so long, deserved to know the truth about the people who had been governing them under a facade of integrity. By afternoon, I had arranged a meeting with the sheriff's department, knowing the moment the footage and evidence reached their hands, the conflict would explode into something far more public, far more complex, and far more impactful than anything I had anticipated when the first fine arrived. Weeks ago, as I sat on the porch watching the sun lower across the fields, the enormity of what was coming pressed against me, not with fear, but with clarity. The battle was shifting toward its climax, and the next steps would determine not only the future of my farm, but the fate of an entire HOA leadership built on manipulation and deception. And as the shadows lengthened across the land that had been targeted so deliberately, I understood with stark certainty that once this evidence was exposed, nothing in the community would ever be the same again. The following days moved with a strange slowness, as though the entire world were waiting for a final verdict that had not yet been spoken aloud. Rumors spread across the community like drifting ash, settling into every doorway, every inbox, every whispered conversation at the end of driveways. Although I didn't need to be told, it quickly became clear that the board members were spiraling in panic behind closed doors, calling emergency meetings and scrambling to understand the full extent of what was unfolding. By then, the sheriff's office had already connected with the county attorney, and additional legal eyes were reviewing the footage, the complaint logs, the repeated acts of trespassing, and the unanswered notices that reflected the board's negligence. The truth was still drifting into place, but the shape of it was unmistakable. Everything Sarah and her allies had done was collapsing under the weight of their own arrogance. I spent much of that time working outdoors, tending to my animals and repairing small parts of the barn that had been pushed aside during months of stress and distraction. And every now and then I saw neighbors lingering farther down the road, watching the property as if trying to understand how it had become the center of something so unexpectedly explosive. A few cars slowed when they passed, occupants staring at the cluster of official vehicles parked near the entrance whenever law enforcement arrived for follow-ups, and others simply kept their heads down. The atmosphere held the uneasy tension of a storm that had passed but might return without warning. It took nearly a week before the HOA board finally reached its breaking point and sent out an official community-wide announcement, one that arrived in inboxes just before dusk, while a warm wind carried the scent of dry leaves across the yard. The message came not from Sarah but from the vice president, who stated in formal, clipped wording that the board had decided to suspend all enforcement actions related to my property pending a comprehensive legal review. They acknowledged that certain procedural errors had occurred and that new temporary leadership would take over while the board underwent a structural audit. There was no apology, of course, nothing resembling accountability, nothing that remotely addressed the reality that the president of the HOA had spent months illegally entering my land in the middle of the night to build a case based on lies. But it didn't matter. The document carried the heavy, reluctant tone of surrender. Soon after the announcement went out, 2 board members resigned outright, citing personal reasons. Another issued a statement disavowing knowledge of Sarah's nighttime trespassing and insisting he had been misled by her reports. Whether or not that was true, I didn't care. The foundation of their authority was fractured beyond repair. The sheriff visited once more with updates that made it clear the investigation was shifting toward prosecution. Evidence was being compiled by the county, lawyers were reviewing the patterns of false claims, and although I couldn't be told every detail, one fact became undeniable. Charges were almost certainly coming. When Sarah finally broke her silence, it was through a letter distributed to every resident. It was a desperate attempt to justify her actions, claiming she had been protecting the community, insisting she had acted out of concern rather than hostility, and suggesting that trespassing was a misinterpretation of her intentions. But the residents weren't buying it. This time, they had video, dates, timelines, and a chain of events that painted a very different picture. The letter only intensified frustration among the homeowners, and it wasn't long before a petition began to circulate demanding her immediate removal from the HOA and urging a special election. I didn't participate in the discussions, nor did I speak publicly about what had happened. Instead, I remained focused on finishing repairs around my property and clearing away the last traces of the emotional damage the HOA had caused. The animals, intuitive as ever, seemed to sense the lifting weight. They were calmer, grazing peacefully without the disruptions that had characterized the previous months. The farm felt alive again, full of the steady rhythm of normalcy returning. By the end of the week, a town hall meeting was scheduled, not by the HOA, but by the community members themselves. The decision came from residents who were tired of secrecy, tired of power plays, and determined to rebuild trust through transparency. I attended only because I knew the sheriff's office and the county needed me present for the public record. The meeting was held at the local elementary school gym, a spacious room filled with folding chairs and the murmuring of nervous voices. People trickled in with tense expressions, their faces a mixture of curiosity, disbelief, and frustration. A large bulletin board had been set up with printed excerpts from the HOA bylaws, copies of past citations, and even still images from the security footage that showed Sarah sneaking across my property at 3 a.m. The room grew almost silent as neighbors filed past the display, studying each image. Some shook their heads in anger, others seemed stunned that everything had gone so far without anyone noticing. When the moderator opened the meeting, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Several residents spoke first, describing how they had long felt intimidated by the HOA, how complaints were often dismissed, how board decisions felt arbitrary and biased, and how Sarah had held too much unchecked power for too long. Their words were careful but edged with years of pent-up resentment. As more people shared their experiences, I realized for the first time how widespread the problem had been. My situation wasn't an isolated injustice. It was part of a pattern. Eventually, they asked me to step forward and recount my experience. I kept it factual, detailing each event from receiving the initial fine to discovering the trespassing footage, filing the report, and verifying that my livestock permits were valid from the start. I described the night I realized someone was entering my property and the fear that accompanied it, the sense of violation that settled in afterward, and the exhaustion of trying to fight a system designed to overpower anyone who questioned it. The room listened with heavy silence, the kind that said people were absorbing every word and comparing it to their own unspoken experiences. When I finished, several residents looked away, their expressions tight with frustration or guilt, as if realizing they might have silently enabled the board's behavior by not speaking up sooner. As the meeting came to a close, a vote was taken. By overwhelming majority, the community chose to dissolve the current board entirely and appoint an interim committee until new elections could be held under the supervision of a third-party mediator. It marked the first time in the neighborhood's history that the entire leadership structure had been replaced. In the days that followed, the sheriff's office concluded the formal investigation. The final notice arrived in a white envelope delivered by a deputy who shook my hand solemnly before leaving. The letter inside confirmed everything. Sarah was being charged with multiple counts of trespassing, falsifying HOA records, and filing fraudulent complaints. The county would pursue criminal charges, and the homeowners were preparing a civil lawsuit for damages caused under her leadership. Although none of this erased what she had done, the legal system was finally catching up to her, piece by piece, and it brought a quiet sense of resolution I hadn't realized I needed. As winter approached, life settled back into familiar patterns. The animals grew their thicker coats, the evening sky darkened earlier, and the crisp sound of frost-covered grass began to accompany my morning chores. One afternoon, while repairing a fence post that had weathered too many storms, I noticed something unexpected. Neighbors were beginning to wave. Some stopped by with cautious smiles, dropping off baked goods or asking if I needed help with supplies. Others offered apologies for not intervening sooner, though I never held any of it against them. Fear made people small sometimes, and the old board had ruled through fear for far too long. What mattered was that things were changing. The new interim committee reached out gently, requesting copies of all documentation so they could formally dismiss the $12,000 fine and clear my record entirely. They assured me this would never happen again, not just to me but to any resident. Transparency and accountability became their first written priorities. And as word spread that the community was healing, the tension that had once clung to every corner of the neighborhood slowly dissolved. Months later, On a quiet morning, when the sky was streaked with pale gold, I walked along the edge of the property where the trespassing paths had once terrified me. Now the land felt peaceful again, free of hidden intentions and shadowy footsteps. The fence line stood firm, the animals grazed contentedly, and the silence carried no threat. Only the soft rhythm of a place restored to safety. It struck me then that the entire ordeal, painful as it had been, had revealed something crucial. That even the most powerful illusion of authority could be undone by truth, persistence, and a single camera capturing what no one was supposed to see. And as I stood there watching the sun rise over the fields that belonged to me and no one else, I understood that the final chapter had already been written, not in the fines or letters or meetings, but in the quiet certainty that justice, though slow, had finally done what it was meant to do.